Night settles over Hawkins like ash after a fire that never truly went out. The town is split by a jagged scar, an open breathing seam where the upside down has fused with the real world. Streetlights flicker on curfews and empty streets. The air carries a metallic chill that doesn't belong to any season. People whisper that the earth is cursed, but the truth feels worse. The ground is changing its mind about what reality is. Morning reveals the new order. Military checkpoints rise at intersections once used for bike races and school runs. Concrete barriers and razor wire cut neighborhoods into fragments of a town that can't remember what wholeness felt like. A stern general arrives with an operation that sounds clinical and merciless, Project Firewall. The briefings are precise, but the fear underneath is sloppy. Seal the breaches. Purge the anomalies. Restore normality, they call it, as though normality is a switch that can be flipped back on. In the chaos, families pack in silence. Some flee, others refuse, clinging to homes like the last proof they ever existed here. Hopper and Joyce move through this panic with the exhaustion of people who have survived too many endings. Joyce outlines evacuation routes, maps trembling in her hands. Hopper scans soldiers with a cop's instinct and a father's rage, sensing that the chain of command has cracks of its own. Across town, the kids are no longer kids. The scars of the previous battle sit on their faces and inside their posture. Dustin watches the sky like a scientist waiting for a storm to confess its math. Mike carries his worry like armor that doesn't fit anymore. Lucas visits the hospital and talks to Max even when her eyes stay closed. Machines hum, steady and indifferent, while he searches for any sign that she's still somewhere behind that silence. Then there's Will. He doesn't say much at first. He doesn't need to. The cold returns to him in a way that feels intimate and cruel. It's not a sudden shock, it's a slow recognition, like hearing an old song coming from a room you thought was empty. He touches the back of his neck, trying to convince himself it's memory. But memory doesn't pulse. Memory doesn't answer. 11 feels it too, but in a different language. Her powers are no longer a reliable fire. They spark, then sputter. She tries small exercises in secret, focused and controlled, until the strain makes her vision tilt. The fear in her isn't just about weakness. It's about what her weakness might invite. She knows the enemy has learned her patterns. She knows a wounded shield can become a doorway. While official voices promise safety, unofficial truths begin to crawl out of locked drawers. Robin, restless and sharp, follows a trail to the town's emergency offices. In a sealed cabinet, she finds a freshly compiled Hawkins catastrophe dossier, maps of fissures, lists of disappearances, forecasts of potential breach sites. The paperwork is meticulous, almost smug, like someone has been preparing for this longer than anyone admits. The group reconvenes under dim light and shared dread. The dossier confirms what their instincts already screamed. This isn't a lingering aftermath. This is a second phase. The war didn't end when Vecna fell back. It simply changed its rhythm. That night, Hawkins goes quiet in the way a forest goes quiet before a predator steps into view. The fissure pulses once, twice, like a heart trying to remember its purpose. And from the darkness a whisper rises, faint but unmistakable. Will's name. Dawn brings order that feels like occupation. The military expands the containment zone with a confidence that borders on denial. Loudspeakers repeat instructions in calm voices, while fear spreads faster than any official statement can control. The town is told to trust the plan, but the plan is the kind that looks clean only on paper. Project Firewall moves from theory to threat. Engineers erect scaffolding near the largest breach. Bomb technicians calibrate devices meant to collapse unstable space. The general frames it as rescue through force, a surgical strike on an infection. But Hawkins isn't a body with a single wound. It's a web of trauma stretched across decades, and every thread leads somewhere deeper than the surface. Nancy and Jonathan don't accept the script they're handed. They work like reporters in a collapsing world, gathering accounts from residents whose stories don't match the official narrative. People describe missing relatives who were never listed in public records. Others claim they've seen soldiers moving civilians at night away from cameras and away from hope. The gaps in truth are now as frightening as the monsters. Robin takes a different path. Quiet, archival, relentless. The library's back rooms smell of dust and forgotten disasters. She digs through filing boxes until she finds a brittle newspaper clipping from 1959. The headline is grim and impossible, describing the ground bleeding, the air turning strange, the town briefly breaking its own rules. The date is decades before the kids were born, decades before Hawkins became synonymous with horror in their lives. The implication lands like ice in her stomach. This place has been unstable far longer than anyone ever said. Steve, refusing to be only a survivor, becomes a protector again. He helps guide families through improvised safe routes, his calm voice masking the fear he refuses to let others inherit. He doesn't want to be a hero for the story. He wants to be a shield for the present. At the hospital, Lucas sits with Max and reads to her, not because he expects an answer, but because silence is a kind of death he won't accept. Her machines remain steady, but during a distant fissure pulse, her readings jitter. It's subtle, but subtle is how miracles first introduce themselves. Meanwhile, Will's sense of invasion grows sharper. The signal isn't just returning, it's refining. It feels intelligent, as though something is testing him, measuring whether his mind is still a viable bridge. He tries to hide this fear, but Mike notices the way Will's eyes keep tracking the horizon, like he's listening for thunder that no one else can hear. 11 watches all of them and feels a brutal truth forming under her ribs. The enemy isn't only out there. It's in the fracture between who they were and who this war is forcing them to become. She wants to strike first, to do something definitive, but her power won't cooperate with desperation. The first firewall test begins at sunset. Sirens wail. Soldiers clear civilians from the perimeter. The explosive is deployed like a final argument. For a moment, the world holds its breath. The blast hits the breach with a thunderous shock. Dust erupts. The air ripples. And for a heartbeat, it looks like success. Then the fissure responds, not by closing, but by widening, like a mouth learning how to laugh. The ground fractures in new directions. A cold wave rolls over the town. Lights die sector by sector. The general's expression shifts from certainty to calculation, the kind that makes people dangerous. Robin clutches the old clipping as if paper can stabilize reality. Nancy and Jonathan exchange a look that says the same thing without words. The truth is bigger than the government's story, bigger than their town, bigger than the last season of pain, and deep inside the widening darkness something stirs with recognition. The war has just accepted their challenge. The morning after the failed firewall test, Hawkins feels like a town that has been struck twice by the same lightning. The air carries a thin, dusty haze, but it isn't smoke. It's something finer, stranger, upside-down spores drifting through streets and ventilation ducts like invisible snow, the kind that settles in your lungs before you even realize you've inhaled the new world. Hospitals begin to fill before the sun reaches its peak. People arrive trembling, describing visions that sound like shared nightmares. A mother insists she saw her kitchen transform into a rotting mirror of itself. A teacher swears the hallway at the high school stretched into a corridor that never ended. Some report time gaps, minutes swallowed whole by a blankness that feels deliberate. The doctors call it mass hysteria. The nurses call it a curse. The kids call it what it is, the upside down testing new ways to spread. Dustin becomes the anchor of logic again, but even his logic is starting to sound like survival poetry. He notices electromagnetic disturbances that don't match the usual patterns. They're rhythmic, almost musical, like a heartbeat broadcasting across the grid. He drags out old AV logs and maps the new surges beside earlier Vecna signatures. The lines overlap too cleanly. This isn't random chaos. This is a signal reclaiming territory. Meanwhile, Hopper lurks at the edges of military operations, reading body language the way he used to read crime scenes. He sees too many closed circles, too many private conversations, too much urgency that isn't meant for the public. The general's confidence is now contaminated with irritation, the frustration of a plan that should have worked but didn't, and the dangerous impulse to double down anyway. Across town, Nancy and Jonathan move with a reporter's hunger and a survivor's dread. They interview families whose loved ones vanished during the overnight evacuation scramble. The names don't appear on any official list. The explanations are thin, the patterns are thick, and every answer they don't get feels like a shadow forming behind their backs. Erica, bored by fear and allergic to authority, slips into the logistics side of the containment zone. She notices supply crates that never reach the places they're labeled for. She hears whispers about relocation units moving under darkness. The implication unsettles even her. Some people aren't being saved. They're being removed. In the middle of all of this, 11 tries to test her strength in silence. She focuses on small objects, tiny motions, controlled bursts, but the power doesn't flow cleanly anymore. When she pushes too hard, she feels a cold resistance, as if something is pushing back from the other side. She is no longer the only force in the room. She is one of two. Will suffers more quietly than anyone. The aftershock is not just in the town, it's inside him. The signal that called his name now floats in and out of his senses with unnerving precision. He feels moments where his perception doubles. Hawkins and the upside down layered like two transparencies, misaligned by a heartbeat. He doesn't say it out loud yet, but his fear is forming into a sentence. This is becoming permanent. By late afternoon, the hospital cameras capture something that changes everything. A corridor's security footage shows a shadow moving against the flow of time, people blurred forward, while the darkness moves backward, purposeful, searching. The clip spreads among the group like a virus of dread. Dustin pins his newest chart beside the older logs, stepping back to see a truth he can't soften. This isn't an invasion anymore. It's an adaptation. Night returns and Hawkins doesn't sleep. The containment zone lights the streets in harsh white arcs, turning the town into a stage where everyone is visible and no one is safe. Joyce studies maps at a kitchen table that feels like a war room. She draws evacuation routes with a trembling determination, the kind that comes from a mother who has already watched the impossible take her family once. Hopper tries to make her slow down, not because he doubts her, but because he recognizes the danger of hope that moves too fast. He's seen the military's mood shift. The first failure didn't humble them, it armed them with a darker urgency. And now their plans are tightening like a noose around the civilians they claim to protect. The kids are pulled into the gravity of adult-level decisions. Mike wants to keep the group together. Dustin wants proof. Lucas wants Max. Will wants silence and can't find it. 11 stands in the center of their fear and feels the weight of being both shield and target. Every time she considers using her powers openly, she imagines cameras locking onto her like predators. Nancy refuses to wait for permission. She and Jonathan follow a paper trail that leads to the emergency office where the catastrophe dossier was first compiled. With Robin acting as lookout and Steve as muscle, they slip into restricted cabinets and find what the public will never be allowed to see, a redacted incident log listing civilians relocated after the Firewall disaster. The pages are brutally neat. Dates, zones, transport codes, everything that makes cruelty look like management. The names are blacked out in thick ink. Nancy's hands shake as she studies the list. Jonathan watches the door. Robin flips through older files, searching for pattern and history. Steve stands guard, but his face hardens with something deeper than fear, betrayal. Because these aren't strangers, these are people who trusted the wrong uniform. Outside, civilian protests begin to gather near the perimeter. Some demand evacuation, others demand truth. The atmosphere is fragile enough to snap. A single shouted rumor sparks panic, and panic becomes violence. Soldiers respond with the kind of force that pretends it has no choice. Back at the hospital, Lucas notices another subtle shift. During a fissure pulse, Max's vitals ripple in sync. It's not a revival, it's a message without language. He leans closer and whispers a promise he can't guarantee, that she will not be left behind in anyone's war plan. Will's condition worsens in a different way. He begins sketching images without knowing why. Old shapes, old symbols, and a house outline that looks too familiar. The drawing feels like a memory that doesn't belong to his lifetime. When he shows it to the group, Robin goes still. It matches markings she found in older archives tied to the Creel property. The redacted log becomes the turning point of the night. Nancy presses her thumb over one blacked-out line, smudging the ink just enough to reveal a name beneath. A ghost of letters emerges. H. Creel. They freeze at the implication. If the government is tracking the Creels again, then they're not just fighting a monster, they're fighting a history someone has been polishing into silence. Night drapes Hawkins in a tense, artificial glow. Floodlights, patrol beams, the cold white of containment. The failed Firewall test has left the town jittering on a new axis of fear, and the kids feel it in the way silence now carries movement. The fractures are not just open, they're active, and every pulse seems to push the town closer to something older than their last fight. The Creel house becomes the unavoidable magnet of their instincts. It sits like a wound stitched into the neighborhood, still half standing, half corrupted. Its architecture now a negotiation between two worlds. The group approaches under cover of darkness, moving with the quiet precision of people who have learned that bravery is sometimes just disciplined fear. Inside, the air feels wrong. The dust doesn't drift, it hangs. The walls feel damp without moisture. The house isn't simply haunted by memory, it's rewritten by it. Dustin runs handheld instruments and watches the readings spike in patterns he can't explain. The signature is familiar, yes, but it's layered with something else, something deeper, like a second voice behind the one they already fear. Robin moves toward the archives she has been building in her mind for weeks. She is the kind of person who believes history is a weapon if you hold it correctly. While Steve and Jonathan watch the exterior stairwell, Robin finds a warped floor panel in the basement and pries it open. Beneath it is a cluster of sealed papers, preserved like a secret someone never expected to be uncovered again. She unfolds a probate letter from the 1940s. The ink is faint, but the meaning is sharp. It references structural anomalies in the lower foundation with a formal recommendation to avoid further reconstruction. There's a line describing sounds at night, low rhythmic pulses, as if the house were built above something that didn't want to stay buried. Nancy reads over her shoulder, and the letter clicks into the pattern she's been chasing. Singled out names, suppressed records, and now proof that the Creel property was flagged long before Henry's descent into monstrosity. Jonathan's face tightens with dread. The implication is clear. Vecna may not have been the origin. He may have been the first human shape the darkness learned to wear. Will stands near the lowest stair, breath shallow, eyes unfocused. The closer they get to the basement core, the more his body seems to react like a tuning fork. He feels the cold pressure again, not as a memory but as an invitation. It's as though the house recognizes him, and that recognition terrifies him more than any visible monster. 11 steps forward, trying to anchor the group with willpower that doesn't fully trust itself. She reaches for her power as gently as possible, testing the air for psychic resistance. It answers her with a subtle pushback, like an ocean current reminding her that she is not the only force in deep water anymore. Above ground, the town seethes with confused anger. Protesters clash with soldiers. The containment perimeter hardens. The general's voice crackles over radios, authorizing escalation. Hawkins is becoming less a town and more a battlefield with an expiration date. Back in the Creel basement, the walls begin to shift, just enough to suggest the house is breathing. A low sound rises through the floorboards, not loud but steady, like an engine waking after decades of sleep. The letter in Robin's hand suddenly feels like a warning delivered too late, and then the house exhales, and the darkness answers back. Morning brings no relief. The air is colder than it should be, and the town feels like it's holding its breath between two disasters. Military convoys move with quiet urgency, and the civilians who remain in Hawkins learn to measure their days by sirens and announcements instead of sunlight. The group regathers in a makeshift safe house, the kind built from borrowed couches and shared exhaustion. The probate letter sits on the table like a living accusation. Dustin compares it against his new signal charts. Nancy cross-references it with the redacted logs. Robin scrolls through her growing archive of historical anomalies. The pieces align too well. Will finally says what his silence has been protecting. The connection never truly ended. He doesn't dramatize it. He doesn't need to. The words land with a quiet weight that changes everything. Mike stiffens, fear turning into protective anger. Lucas looks away, afraid of what another possessed friend might cost them. Dustin's mind races toward a solution that doesn't yet exist. 11 listens more than she speaks. She understands this terrain in a way the others can't. A psychic link is not just a doorway, it's a negotiation. And if Will is still tethered, then the enemy has a thread to pull. They decide on a risk that feels both insane and inevitable. 11 will attempt a controlled dive into Will's mind state, not to overpower the signal, but to map it. They prepare the room like a ritual of science and trust. Dim lights, breathing exercises, grounding anchors, familiar objects that tie the mind to the real world. If fear is a current, they will need ballast. As 11 sinks into the link, the world around her blurs into layered images. She sees Hawkins as it is now, broken, militarized, fragile. Then the imagery shifts, sliding backward in time like a film reel unspooling without permission. She glimpses streets that look older, the town half-built, the land carrying a tension she can feel even without words. The sensation is chilling. The instability predates everything they thought began in 1983. Will's mind becomes a corridor of cold echoes. She senses the familiar shade of Vecna's imprint, but behind it is a larger presence, less human, less personal. The energy feels ancient, indifferent, predatory in a patient way. It isn't angry. It is hungry. Above ground, the military accelerates Firewall's second phase, this time with heavier equipment and less tolerance for dissent. Hopper hears the same clipped phrases repeated in briefings. Contain, eliminate, silence. The tone is no longer protective. It is preemptive. At the hospital, Lucas receives a call that jolts him upright. Max's brain activity has spiked again during the latest fissure pulse. A doctor hands him the chart with the wary gravity of someone who knows this is no longer purely medical. The chart shows a pattern, rhythmic surges that mirror the breach pulses almost perfectly. Max is not just injured, she is connected. Back in the safe house, 11 pulls out of the link with a gasp that sounds like returning from underwater. Her face is pale, her eyes are focused. She tells them she saw something worse than a monster. She saw a timeline, and in that timeline, Hawkins is not the beginning of the story. It is the place where the oldest story finally decided to speak. The hospital room is too bright, too clean, too ordinary for the war that's bleeding through Hawkins. Lucas sits beside Max with the stubborn devotion of someone who refuses to let reality decide the ending. The latest brain activity chart rests in his hands like a fragile prophecy. The pattern is undeniable. Every time the fissures pulse, something inside Max answers. Not consciousness, not speech, something quieter, a signal of presence, a proof of captivity. Outside, the town continues its slow conversion into a military machine. Loudspeakers broadcast safety protocols. Checkpoints harden. Helicopters cut the sky in low arc like vultures pretending to be guardians. The general's patience has curdled into aggression. Project Firewall is no longer an experiment. It's a threat hovering over every civilian roof. But the kids have something the military doesn't understand. They aren't trying to defeat the enemy with force alone. They are trying to reach the people the enemy is using as anchors. At the safe house, Dustin pulls out a portable radio array and a cluster of hacked frequency notes. He looks exhausted, but alive with purpose. If the upside down is a hive of patterns, then patterns can be disrupted. Erica helps him recalibrate the equipment with the ruthless efficiency of someone who doesn't believe in rules that weren't built to protect her. Robin acts as the archive brain, cross-checking old anomalies with new pulses. She keeps her voice steady, but her eyes betray the fear that history is repeating itself with sharper teeth. Nancy pushes harder, building a private list of missing persons that refuses to match the official narrative. Jonathan shadows her like a vow. Steve watches the door like a soldier who never asked for a war but won't abandon the front line. Will does not speak much anymore, but his silence has shape. He experiences the world as overlapping images. Hawkins as it stands, and Hawkins as it decays in its shadow version. At times it's so vivid he flinches as if reality itself has touched him. He tries to hide these moments from Mike, but Mike knows him too well. The fear they share is simple and terrifying. Will may still be a doorway the enemy intends to fully reopen. 11 watches all of them and feels the weight of a truth she can't escape. Her powers are unstable but not absent. They're shifting, changing response modes, as if the psychic battlefield itself is evolving. She senses that brute force might be the worst possible move. If she attacks recklessly, she could widen the connection instead of severing it. So they attempt something more delicate. They build a sensory anchor plan for Max, not a rescue by violence, but a rescue by identity. Lucas brings in her favorite tapes. He sets up headphones on her bedside table. He reads a handwritten letter aloud, voice steady even when his hands shake. He tells her about their friends, about the town, about the small memories that feel like oxygen in a collapsing world. As the music begins, her heart monitor responds with a subtle rhythm, almost in sync with the fissure pulse, but not identical. It's like two metronomes gradually finding the same beat. Dustin and Erica amplify the moment from across town, activating a brief signal disruptor cycle timed to the pulse. The equipment hums, the lights flicker, the air goes still. Lucas leans closer and speaks words that aren't borrowed from any script. They are raw, original, desperate. Max's fingers twitch. It is small enough to be dismissed by a skeptical room, but in this war, small is how hope returns. The machines spike again, the music swells, and for one breath-long second, his name seems to register in her body like a lighthouse catching a distant ship. Then the hospital lights dim without warning, and over the intercom, a new security alert begins to blare, as if something inside the breach has noticed their attempt. Hawkins has always been a small-town story pretending it was ordinary. Now it's a national secret pretending it's manageable. The days are measured in curfews and rumors, and the nights are measured in pulses from the fissures that look less like cracks and more like veins. Robin can't stop thinking about the 1959 clipping. Nancy can't stop thinking about the redacted log. The more they uncover, the clearer the pattern becomes. The government didn't simply react to the catastrophe. It anticipated it, or worse, helped shape the conditions that made it inevitable. So they go where secrets are supposed to sleep. At dusk, Nancy, Robin, and Jonathan slip into a restricted city archive with Steve as silent backup. The building is old enough to smell like paper and complacency. Filing cabinets line a back storage room that hasn't seen real scrutiny in years. If history is a crime scene, this is where the fingerprints were supposed to fade. They find land surveys from the 1800s, some mislabeled, some missing, some clearly tampered with. Robin's hands move fast, flipping pages with the hunger of someone who knows the right document can change the entire narrative of a war. Then she finds it, an 1812 township map marked with a formal warning, a no settlement zone, a blot of ink over the area that will eventually become the Creole land, and later the lab's shadowed orbit. The note is written in the careful language of people who choose politeness over panic. It hints at ground instability, unexplained sink events, and unusual atmospherics. Nancy stares at the map and feels the past tilt into the present. If Hawkins was flagged centuries ago, then the upside down isn't an accident born of one experiment. It's a door that has been thinning for generations. The lab may have intensified it, Henry may have been shaped by it, but the soil was already waiting. They photograph everything, they copy the margins, they take what they can before the night swallows the building into silence again. Meanwhile, Hopper grows increasingly convinced that the military's internal structure is fractured by ambition. He overhears coded discussions, references to assets and conduits that sound less like protection and more like ownership. Joyce is forced to balance two realities at once, keeping the kids alive and keeping the adults from turning this town into an unmarked grave. Back at the safe house, Dustin spreads documents across a table like a general assembling a war plan from fragments of time. He overlays the 1812 map with modern fissure locations. The alignment is sickeningly precise. The largest breaches track like a path toward one central point, a heart beneath the town. Will watches the maps and feels numb recognition. His senses flare in discomfort, as if the paper itself is emitting cold. He doesn't know how to explain it without sounding impossible, so he simply says that some places feel louder than others, even when they're silent. 11 listens and understands. For her, psychic geography is as real as streets. She can almost feel the thin places like pressure points in the air. The group begins to see the new truth. This season's fight won't be won by chasing monsters across the surface. It will be won by finding the root. Whatever ancient structure, memory lattice, or buried doorway has been feeding the town's collapse for longer than anyone wants to admit. As they pack the maps and prepare a new plan, a distant siren sounds through the night. Another firewall deployment is being moved into position. The military is preparing to force an ending. The kids are preparing to uncover the beginning. And somewhere beneath Hawkins, the ground answers with a slow, patient pulse, as if the town itself is listening to their footsteps. Hawkins is no longer a town that waits for disaster. It is a town rehearsing it. The streets feel hollow. Even when people walk them, the sky looks bruised, and the fissures, those raw seams in reality, pulse with an ugly patience, like they're counting down to something that doesn't need permission. Dustin refuses to let fear stay abstract. He turns the safe house into a command center of paper, wires, and stubborn belief. Old, missing person flyers, hospital reports, radio logs, the 1812 township map, the 1959 clipping, the redacted lists Nancy stole. He lays everything out with the ruthless neatness of a mind trying to beat chaos using structure. He begins building a ledger, not a metaphorical one, a literal timeline, handwritten line after line, names and dates spanning centuries. He logs every documented disappearance, every reported ground anomaly, every unexplained blackout that folklore tried to soften into ghost stories. The deeper he goes, the more the pattern stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like design. Robin watches him work with quiet dread. She has spent weeks learning that history doesn't vanish, it hides. Nancy adds her new list of modern disappearances to the ledger, and the devastation becomes measurable. Jonathan cross-checks with local testimonies from people too afraid to speak on record. Steve keeps watch, but even he can't ignore the weight of what's forming on the table. Will stands at the edge of the room like a sensitive instrument kept near a storm. The more Dustin writes, the more Will feels the signal flutter inside him. It's sharper today, almost curious, as if something on the other side recognizes that they are stepping closer to the truth. 11 tries to train quietly, searching for a stable way back into full strength. She focuses on control rather than force, breathing, concentration, short bursts of movement. But every attempt feels like pushing against thick water. The resistance isn't just a lack of energy. It feels like a counter-pressure, like a second mind waiting for her to overextend so it can exploit the opening. Outside, the military is accelerating operations with a confidence that looks like denial. Convoys shift toward the largest breach sites. New equipment arrives at night under blackout protocols. The general's language has become clinical and cold. Containment, neutralization, acceptable losses. But inside the safe house, something more terrifying than a convoy is taking shape on paper. The ledger reveals a cycle, a repeating rhythm of breach and silence, a spike of disappearances, then a lull, then a memory wash, where the town collectively shrugs off what it can't explain. Dustin circles dates, draws lines, overlays them with historical notes he pulled from Robin's archive. Then he stops writing, because the next expected point on the cycle is not in the past. It is now. He calculates the convergence date with the shaky precision of someone who hates being right. The astronomical note from old records aligns with modern signal spikes. The pattern is too perfect to be ignored. Days away. Nancy reads the date and feels her throat tighten. Steve exhales like he's bracing for impact. Robin's face drains, less from fear and more from the realization that Hawkins has been walking into the same trap for generations. Will presses a hand to the back of his neck. The cold sensation is stronger than ever. He understands something before anyone says it out loud. The enemy isn't waking up. It has been awake. And the ledger is proof that this time it intends to finish the cycle where it began. Fear changes shape when it meets proof. Hawkins has survived rumors, survived monsters, survived the kind of trauma that should have broken it into dust. But documents, cold, precise, undeniable, transform panic into clarity. Hopper feels that shift first. He has been tracking military movements with the instinct of a man who knows authority can be as dangerous as evil. After the Firewall failure, he notices new personnel rotating in. Quiet men with blank eyes, officers who don't answer to the local chain of command. Their laptops are always closed when civilians approach. Their conversations stop mid-sentence. And their checkpoints are less about safety and more about control. Joyce tries to keep the kids focused on escape routes, but even she can't ignore the growing sense that the government isn't simply afraid of the upside down. It's invested in it. Hopper corners a mid-level insider during a nighttime equipment transfer. The man is nervous enough to talk if pushed in the right direction. He insists the operation is classified beyond the general. He slips a name that sounds like a ghost of a lab era Hawkins never got to bury. A program, not new, old, quiet, designed to monitor psychic conduits long before the town's cracks went public. Hopper hears enough to understand the shape of the truth. The government has been tracking children with unusual abilities across decades, and Henry Creel may have been one of their earliest obsessions. The implication lands like a punch. Vecna wasn't just a freak accident of evil. He was observed, studied, possibly even guided by systems that believed they could turn a storm into a weapon. Meanwhile, Nancy and Jonathan chase the paper trail from a different angle. They exploit the chaos of public protests and the military's tightening perimeter to slip into a temporary command hub. Erica distracts a guard with rehearsed civilian outrage, while Steve creates a brief window of access. Robin moves like a shadow through filing racks. They find it, a classified memo with old dates and newer annotations. The layout is clinical, but the moral ugliness bleeds through every line. The document references early monitoring protocols for Subject 001, long-term observation, containment considerations, risk forecasting. It reads like a blueprint for how to study a human being until the human part becomes secondary. And near the end, a line shifts the present into focus, a new code and a new priority. Subject 011, asset recovery. 11 reads the words and feels the room tilt. The world narrows to the familiar ache of being reduced to a number. Mike's reaction is immediate and protective, but fear is sharper this time because the memo doesn't sound like a rescue plan. It sounds like ownership reclaiming property. Will, silent as ever, studies the memo with the haunted precision of someone who has been a victim of systems on both sides of reality. The Upside Down wants him as a bridge. The government may want 11 as leverage, and the timing of both ambitions is converging on the same tightening window, Dustin calculated. Hopper arrives at the safe house with the insider's half-confession. Joyce reads the memo and goes cold with fury. The adults finally see what the kids already understood emotionally. This war has two enemies. One is ancient and hungry. The other wears a badge and thinks hunger can be managed. The chapter ends with an abrupt announcement over military radio. A new operational phase is authorized to begin immediately, and in the hush that follows, it becomes painfully clear. The government is preparing to take 11 before the convergence date arrives. The memo sits on the table like a loaded gun. Subject 011, asset recovery. In one sterile line, the government transforms 11 from a person into a possession they believe they misplaced. The words don't just threaten her freedom, they threaten the fragile identity she's been building since the day she escaped being a number. 11 doesn't argue, she doesn't panic. She goes still in the dangerous way storms do before they move. Then she makes a decision that feels like betrayal to some and survival to all. She disappears. Joyce helps without hesitation, pulling old instincts from the years she spent smuggling her family through nightmares nobody else believed. She lays out fake identity papers, new routes, and safe houses that exist between the blind spots of military patrols. Hopper fights the plan at first, not because it's wrong, but because every part of him hates the idea of running again. Yet he can't deny what the memo means. If the government gets 11 first, they won't save Hawkins. They'll weaponize the war. Mike insists on going with her. It turns into a quiet fracture within the group. Dustin argues that they need every mind at the center. Lucas is torn between Max's bedside and the battlefield. Nancy wants proof exposed before the government can bury it again. Will says almost nothing, but the tension in his face makes it clear he's carrying a fear too heavy to name. Because Will feels the connection intensifying. The cold signal doesn't just flicker anymore, it sharpens into intent. At night he experiences brief lapses where the border between Hawkins and the Upside Down seems to thin inside his own senses. He tells Mike carefully that if the enemy can't fully reach 11, it might try to reach her through him. The idea chills them both. Dustin begins writing a contingency plan that doesn't rely on psychic power. He sketches crude diagrams of signal disruptors, music-based grounding protocols, and coded frequency interference. He refuses to accept a future where their only option is to gamble everything on one fragile power set. Steve volunteers to move supplies between civilian safe points, quietly assembling a backup resistance network. Robin stays glued to the archives, searching for any older thread that links the current military language to earlier Hawkins lab programs. Nancy and Jonathan work the edges of the containment zone, gathering testimonies, names, and dates. building a case strong enough to survive, even if they don't. By midnight, 11 and Mike are traveling undercover, guided by Joyce's directions and Hopper's protective rage. The roads outside Hawkins feel colder, quieter, as though the town's infection is radiating outward. 11 keeps her hood low, trying not to become a myth again, but the military is faster than they feared. A drone sweeps over a wooded stretch near their temporary hideout. The hum grows louder, tighter. A search grid folds into place with cold efficiency. 20 minutes later, a patrol truck turns onto the dirt road like it was always destined to find them. 11 closes her eyes. She tries to call her power gently, just enough to defend, not enough to expose an opening. The air resists her. She whispers something original and raw, not a borrowed line, more a vow than a threat. And outside, the drone locks onto the exact coordinates of their shelter. Hawkins is running out of time. Dustin's convergence date hangs over the group like a storm forecast. They can't escape. The fissures are pulsing more frequently now, not randomly, but with the disciplined rhythm of something preparing a final sequence. While the military hunts 11, the rest of the group shifts into emergency unity. They dig into the town's fractured geometry, old maps, new readings, the historical warnings Robin unearthed. The pieces align toward one terrifying conclusion. The biggest breaches aren't scattered chaos, they are arteries, and they lead to a single heart beneath the town. Nancy takes the lead on the ground-level truth, while Robin cross-references the oldest town documents she can find. Jonathan helps connect newer disappearances to older suppressed records. Steve coordinates civilian movement into safer pockets, refusing to let panic become a second enemy. Hopper, grim and furious, pushes deeper into military command to stop the future he can now see too clearly. He discovers an escalation plan hidden beneath the public narrative, an emergency strike authorization designed to neutralize the overlap zone in one catastrophic blow. The language is bureaucratic. The intent is mass casualty. He steals a copy of the order and brings it to Joyce. They read it together in silence. Stamped, signed, timed. The launch window aligns with the convergence date. The government is planning to burn Hawkins down to save the world from admitting it was never in control. Joyce's anger is quiet but lethal. She refuses to let her town become a laboratory's final cleanup operation. At the hospital, Lucas receives another update that hits like a jolt of electricity. Max's EEG spikes again, stronger this time, synchronized with the fissure rhythm, as if her mind is tethered to the same hidden system beneath the town. A doctor places the chart in his hands. The subtext is unspoken but clear. Max may not be merely recovering. She may be trapped on the other side of a psychic lattice. Will feels the same truth from within his own bones. He points to the maps with a tremor in his voice, explaining that certain locations feel louder in his senses, like the world is thinner there. He has no scientific language for it, but he doesn't need one. The group trusts the terror in his honesty. 11 is still off-grid, yet her absence doesn't weaken the plan, it reframes it. They can't wait for her to become fully stable again. They must act with what they have. The decision forms fast. They will locate and descend into the central heart breach before the military strike can begin. Dustin doesn't celebrate the logic of it. He just nods like someone accepting a tightrope because the ground has vanished. As the night deepens, radios crackle with new movement orders. Project Firewall's second phase is mobilizing. The strike clock is now real. Hopper stares at the authorization order one last time and realizes the truth that turns his blood cold. He doesn't just have to stop the launch. He has to stop it within hours, because the countdown has already started. Hawkins feels like a tightened fist on the verge of snapping. Sirens echo across neighborhoods already carved into zones of fear. The military presence is thicker than ever. Armored vehicles, high-beam towers, soldiers who refuse eye contact because they know what's coming and don't want to bear witness when it does. Inside the safe house, the group gathers around a flickering lantern. The air is heavy with the knowledge Hopper brought back. The strike order is active. A detonation designed to collapse the entire overlap zone, killing anything, anyone, and any truth the government can't control. The silence after the reveal is the kind that no one has the courage to break at first. Joyce is the one who finally speaks. Not a plea, not a collapse, a decision. They are not abandoning Hawkins, not their children, not the thousands of people trapped inside a lie and a war they didn't ask for. The adults are stepping into the battlefield now, not because they're stronger, but because they refuse to let the kids carry the story alone. Hopper moves with purpose, gathering allies inside the fractured military ranks. Some soldiers know something is wrong. They've seen the quiet civilian removals, the forced relocations that were never filed. They've felt the unease of serving a plan that treats a town like a test site. Under Hopper's blunt honesty and Joyce's fierce resolve, a few choose humanity over orders. Meanwhile, Nancy and Jonathan use the rising protest chaos to their advantage. They slip between barricades, recording testimonies from residents whose families have vanished without explanation. They broadcast a pirate signal using stolen equipment, a manifesto of truths the government buried. Each word is a spark, and sparks in a town this dry with fear become wildfire. Steve and Robin escort civilians through underground corridors, old storm drains and maintenance tunnels mapped only in fading blueprints. Robin directs traffic like a general. Steve keeps watch like a knight who has stopped waiting for permission to protect the people he loves. Back at the safe house, Dustin spreads updated fissure readings and the 1812 map across the floor. The heart breach lies beneath Hawkins. He underlines the conclusion with shaking hands. They need to go down there. They need to disrupt it from within before the military scorches everything from above. The group prepares for descent. Will feels the psychic hum intensify as they get closer to the convergence date. The air around him distorts slightly, not visibly but emotionally, as though his heartbeats are syncing with a timeline that wants to pull him somewhere he doesn't belong. As the evacuation corridors fill with terrified families, Lucas arrives breathless from the hospital. Max's monitors surged again, sharper, stronger. For the first time since the attack, her fingers moved twice. Once wasn't luck, twice is pattern, twice is intention. Max is somewhere inside the lattice, somewhere alive. But saving Max is no longer a standalone mission. It is part of a war where psychic hostages are weapons. Hopper sends a coded message across an encrypted channel, a short, brutal line that means everything. Phase 2 must be stopped at any cost. Seconds later, military loudspeakers roar across the containment zone. All civilians return indoors immediately. New protocols are active. The sky glows with the hum of powering machinery. The countdown for the strike has officially begun, and through that rising tension, the kids prepare to descend into the heart of the town that refuses to die. The entrance to the heart breach is nothing like the swirling portals they've fought before. It lies beneath the old utility district, an industrial skeleton Hawkins forgot it built. Rusted pipes groan overhead. Water drips rhythmically in the darkness. The air feels denser, as if gravity knows what they're about to do and wants to stop them. Dustin, Erica, Will, Eleven's empty spot, Robin, Nancy, Jonathan, Lucas, and Steve stand on a grated floor that looks like it should collapse under the weight of their fear. Hopper and Joyce stay above to confront the military threat, but their voices echo through the group's minds like protective ghosts. Dustin activates the signal disruptor, a compact device designed from scavenged parts, intuition, and defiance. Its hum spreads outward, thinning the psychic noise for a few precious minutes. The group begins its descent through a maintenance shaft that hasn't been used in decades. The deeper they go, the stranger the environment becomes. Metal gives way to stone. Stone gives way to something like bone, and bone gives way to a corrupted geometry that doesn't obey any architect or natural law. The upside down isn't invading Hawkins anymore, it's merging with it. Robin quietly narrates their findings into her recorder, cataloging evidence with the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, will need these records if they fail. Nancy moves in tight formation, gun ready, eyes burning not with fear, but with purpose. Jonathan stays close, protecting her flank. Steve, carrying only a flashlight and a nail-studded bat that has become an extension of his soul, takes point. He leads not because he thinks he's the strongest, but because he refuses to let the kids walk into darkness ahead of him. Will's breathing changes as they approach a narrow corridor. His eyes unfocus. The walls shift in his peripheral vision, rippling as if remembering a shape they haven't settled on. The heartbeat of the ground grows stronger. Dustin puts a hand on Will's shoulder, a silent promise, a grounding. Lucas follows quietly, torn between terror for Max and hope in the impossible. He holds her letter inside his jacket pocket. He hasn't reread it. He doesn't need to. Her handwriting feels like a compass pointing forward. Then they reach the chamber, a burned cavern carved by something older than Hawkins and older than human memory. The walls pulse faintly, glowing in sickly blues and crimson veins. Suspended through the center is a lattice of organic strands, like a web made of nerves, roots, and fractured timelines woven together. The air vibrates. Will staggers. He feels two timelines pressing against each other, bleeding into his senses. 11 isn't here physically, but her absence feels like a missing limb. They know they will have to synchronize their efforts without her power. They know time is thinning like frayed rope. Dustin unfolds a worn hand map, drawn from vibrations, predictions, and his inability to accept defeat. The map marks safe paths and unstable sections. He sets it against the cavern floor. The ink on the map begins to bleed, slowly, deliberately, rewriting the path beneath their feet. Robin gasps. Steve raises the bat. Nancy steadies her breath. The ground pulses again, stronger, as if the upside down just realized they've entered its heart. Above them, somewhere in the collapsing town, a siren blares. Another strike mechanism spins up, and below, at the threshold of an ancient void, the living map shows a new path. One that wasn't there moments ago. A path leading inward, a path that seems to be waiting for them. The deeper they go, the less Hawkins feels like a town and more like an infection that has learned how to think. The tunnel walls shimmer with strange reflections, metallic, damp, alive. The group's flashlights bend light into shapes that look almost familiar, like ghosts half remembering their faces. Will stops first. "Wait," he says, his voice thinner than the air. His reflection isn't following his movement. It lags, just a heartbeat behind, watching him instead of copying. A cold awareness crawls down his spine. This place isn't showing them their reflections. It's showing the world's memory of them. Every fear, every lie, every unresolved guilt is etched into the silver film of the walls. Then it begins. The corridor splinters into passages that shouldn't exist, each leading to personal echoes. Lucas finds himself walking toward the image of Max standing on the snow-covered tracks, her hand stretched toward him. Nancy sees the newsroom burning, her articles shredded by unseen wind. Steve watches a younger version of himself abandon his friends during the first night of terror. And Will sees himself as the boy in the shed again, the one who screamed and no one heard. Dustin tries to keep them tethered to reality. "They're psychic projections," he calls out. "The hive is reading us." His voice echoes and folds, distorted by something bigger than acoustics. The group forms a circle, backs to one another, repeating their own names like lifelines. Robin fumbles in her pack for her recorder and starts narrating, an anchor in the madness. The sound of her voice steadies them just enough to move. They break through the corridor into a vast chamber. The architecture shifts constantly, Floor plates twisting into staircases, staircases flattening into rippling ground. It's a living organism made of grief and time. At its center, Will sees something human within the distortion, a figure bound by luminous threads, trembling but aware. 11's psychic imprint, her consciousness echoing faintly through the upside down. She's not physically here, but the lattice remembers her. It's studying her the way scientists study fire. Then something else rises behind that light, a dark silhouette, tall, rippling, half human, half algorithm of hatred. Not Vecna, but what Vecna served. The old consciousness, it speaks without words. A whisper inside bone, we were here first. The cavern trembles, the walls pulse faster. Dustin yells for everyone to fall back, but the exits twist like a maze collapsing into itself. The entity doesn't attack. It observes. And that's worse, because observation means curiosity. Curiosity means intent. As they retreat toward a higher ledge, the last thing they see is their own reflections, fusing into one another on the wall. Past, present, and possible futures bleeding into a single monstrous outline. And somewhere far above, the first of the strike sirens begins to sound. They make it back to the upper corridor, gasping, clothes streaked with ash and sweat. The air tastes like iron. Dustin slams the disruptor switch, and for a few blessed seconds, the psychic noise fades into a heavy silence. But Will collapses. The pulse inside him spikes so sharply it almost glows beneath his skin. 11's absence has left a gap, and the hive is trying to fill it through him. Mike kneels beside him, panic barely contained. "You're still you," he whispers, as if the sentence itself could build a wall strong enough to hold back the invasion. Will looks up, eyes unfocused, and mutters, "It's not one mind, it's a language." The words freeze everyone. Robin demands an explanation. Will can barely breathe, but he manages. It's not just control, it's communication. Every pulse is a word. It's talking to itself, through us. Dustin grabs his notebook, sketching wildly, matching the rhythm of the breach pulses to Will's heartbeat. The pattern translates into a mathematical code, a repeating structure, a syntax of existence. He realizes the upside down isn't random chaos. It's a system rewriting reality's grammar. As the realization lands, the ground rumbles again. The hive is reacting. It knows they're decoding it. Nancy and Jonathan secure Will's body, while Lucas and Steve hold the perimeter. Erica calls out readings from the disruptor. Frequencies spiking, interference failing. Robin runs translation models through her recorder, muttering equations that sound like prayers. Hopper's voice crackles faintly over a damaged radio. Phase 2 has been authorized. Strike in less than 3 hours. His tone breaks. Get out now, that's an order. But leaving isn't an option. If they run, the hive wins. The military will destroy what remains, and the cycle will start again somewhere else. They need to sever the root. Will's trembling stabilizes into focus. "It's teaching me," he says quietly. "It wants to be understood." Dustin shakes his head. "No, it wants to use you to rewrite the boundary." 11's voice flickers faintly through the static, soft, distorted, but unmistakable. "Don't let it finish the sentence." For a heartbeat, Will smiles through tears. "She's here," he whispers. Then, without warning, the walls surge inward, reality folding like paper soaked in water. The group scrambles for footing as fissures burst upward, spewing a faint glow. The hive is speaking faster now, filling the space with psychic noise. Dustin realizes what he's hearing isn't random anymore. It's repetition. The same phrase again and again, modulated across frequencies like a chant. He jots it down line by line, decoding through instinct and terror until it resolves into English letters. "We were built to remember." The lights in the cavern flare. Will screams as the signal inside him peaks into blinding white. 11's voice cuts through the chaos one final time, calm, resolute. "Then I'll teach you how to forget." The disruptor explodes in a shower of sparks. everything goes white. And the sound that follows isn't thunder, it's silence learning how to breathe. The whiteout fades into a sickly twilight, and the group wakes to the sound of dripping that isn't water. It's thicker, slower, like the upside down is bleeding its own time. The disruptor is gone, reduced to charred fragments scattered across the floor. Whatever quiet zone they had carved out has collapsed. The hive is loud again. They push forward anyway. The corridors widen into a cathedral-like expanse where the architecture stops pretending to be human. The ceiling arches with ribbed structures that look grown, not built. The air is cold, but not empty. Every breath feels monitored. At the center stands the throne lattice, a towering web of living strands that pulse with the same rhythm as the fissures above Hawkins. It's not a seat, it's a network, a command organ. Dustin steadies himself and opens his field notebook, sketching the geometry in quick, shaking lines. He labels nodes, counts the pulses, traces a pattern that feels too deliberate to be natural. Beside him, Erica reads handheld meters and calls out rising energy spikes. Nancy scans the perimeter for exits while Jonathan watches her flank, eyes sharp with the quiet panic of someone who knows the world can end in a single bad angle. And Will is the compass. His body reacts to the lattice like a magnet drawn toward a forbidden pole. His eyes glaze for moments, then sharpen with sudden clarity. He points to a strand cluster where the glow is denser, more human in tone. That's a memory core, he murmurs. Not a guess, a recognition. They approach. Inside the lattice, suspended in glass-like psychic prisons, flicker fragments of identities, echoes of victims and survivors reduced to energy signatures. The sight is unbearable. The hive hasn't just harvested bodies, it has harvested stories. 11 isn't with them physically, but her presence brushes the edges of Will's senses like a hand on a shoulder through smoke. He hears her faintly in the static of his own mind. The feeling is bittersweet, proof she's alive, proof she's still hunted. Then Lucas stops. He hears something that shouldn't be possible, a thin, familiar voice buried under the hive's noise. He presses his palm against a lattice strand and feels it respond with a tremor that feels like a heartbeat he once held in his hands. Max. He pulls the folded letter from Isa's jacket. Creased, smudged, nearly illegible now. He doesn't read it aloud because there's no air for tenderness here, but he holds it up as if the handwriting itself is a key. The strand glow shifts. A small, cracked symbol appears in the psychic space like an artifact surfacing from a drowned room. A cassette label with Max's name formed in light, then shattered into sparks. It's the hive mocking them, or Max fighting to mark her existence. Steve steps forward, without hesitation, placing himself between the group and the inevitable swarm that begins to gather in the shadows. He has no speech, no grand declaration. He just raises his bat as if to say, "If the world is ending, it ends after you." Dustin whispers the plan into the tension. The memory core is tethered to Will's connection. If they sever it cleanly, they might destabilize the lattice long enough to pull Max back, but the move is dangerous. As 11's distant presence intensifies, Will's breathing grows shallow. He knows what Dustin can't fully calculate. To reach Max, they might have to use him as the bridge. The lattice pulses violently, sensing their intent. The shadows surge like a tide. And above them, far beyond the living cathedral, the military strike clock keeps ticking toward a decision that won't wait for miracles. Above ground, Hawkins fractures in a different way, politically, morally, publicly. The town is no longer just a battlefield between worlds. It's a battlefield between narratives. Hopper moves through a command corridor lined with radios and sealed doors, carrying a stolen strike authorization order folded inside his jacket like contraband truth. His face is bruised with exhaustion, but his posture is a weapon. He corners the general in a private operations room where the lights are bright enough to make guilt visible. Joyce enters with him, not as backup, but as force. They don't plead. They confront. The general recites the language of necessity. The world can't risk the spread. The overlap must be neutralized. Casualties are regrettable but acceptable. Hopper responds with the language of consequence. If they fire, they won't be saving the world. They'll be erasing a crime scene, destroying a town to bury decades of arrogance. While that battle intensifies behind closed doors, Nancy and Jonathan prepare their own strike. They have gathered enough testimonies, logs, and historical proof to expose the program's skeleton. Robin has stitched the timeline together with archival precision: the 1812 map, the 1959 clipping, the redacted relocations, and the new memo labeling 11 as an asset. Erica has secured copies of supply manifests that reveal civilians moved off record. The evidence is no longer a theory, it's a case. They assemble a pirate broadcast station using stolen transmitters and a jury-rigged antenna hidden inside an abandoned storefront. The room vibrates with urgency, the kind that turns fear into velocity. Nancy records a statement that is clear and ruthless. Jonathan edits it down to the core truth. Robin adds corroborating references and dates. Erica prepares the upload packet like a hacker prepping a grenade. When the broadcast goes live, it doesn't sound like rebellion. It sounds like a town taking back ownership of its own story. The message spreads fast, across cars parked in fearful silence, across living rooms where families have been told to wait quietly for salvation. As people listen, something transforms. Panic is replaced by focus. Rumor is replaced by proof. The military's moral advantage evaporates in real time. Crowds begin to gather again, but this time the energy is different. Not chaos, defiance. Citizens demand answers, not evacuation slogans. They chant names of missing people the government refused to list. They hold up printed copies of the leaked documents like shields. In the command center, the general's face hardens as he realizes the problem has grown bigger than the breach. He is losing control of the narrative. Hopper uses that moment. He forces a delay, small, fragile, but real, by rallying sympathetic officers who now fear being recorded on the wrong side of history. The strike window doesn't disappear, but it wobbles. Underground, the group feels the ripple of that surface chaos in a strange way. The hive grows restless, its pulse shifting erratically, as if public truth is a frequency it wasn't designed to withstand. Dustin notices the change and writes it down with frantic clarity. He's not sure why it matters yet, only that it does. Will feels it too, like a pressure easing for a split second. The war, he realizes, is now being fought in two realms, one with psychic blades, one with paper and broadcast light, and both may be necessary to save Hawkins before the countdown reaches zero. The pirate broadcast has cracked something above ground, but below Hawkins the hive responds with a different kind of intelligence, quiet, adaptive, predatory. The throne lattice flickers in uneven rhythms now, as though it is recalculating the cost of letting humans name their own truth. Inside the cathedral chamber, the group moves with the desperate coordination of people who understand time has become a hostile element. Dustin's notebook is open again, pages filled with quick sketches of the lattice geometry. He marks a cluster of strands that glow with a denser, more human cadence. Will stands beside him, pale and rigid, like a compass that is tired of pointing toward pain. "It's not just control," Will says, voice strained. "It's memory." He doesn't need to explain further. The air here is heavy with harvested identities, echoes of lives compressed into energy. The hive is not merely feeding on fear, it's feeding on story, on imprint, on the very thing that makes survival meaningful. Nancy steadies her flashlight on a seam in the lattice where the organic fibers meet something older, fossil-like, sacred and wrong. Jonathan watches her breathe through the fear, refusing to let her face this architecture of horror alone. Robin records everything she can in short bursts, as if documentation itself might become a weapon. Erica checks the meters, and whispers the worst news quietly. The pulse cycle is accelerating. Lucas steps closer to the memory core and feels the tension in his stomach twist into a single ferocious purpose. He presses Max's letter to his chest like armor. The writing is smeared now, but the meaning is intact. It is proof she is loved here. Proof she is not just a hostage inside a monster's library. Then something changes in the psychic air. A chalk-like inscription appears across the inner membrane of the chamber, faint at first, then clearer, like a message surfacing from deep water. The words are crude, human, and impossibly ancient in their tone. The boy who remembers ends the war. The group freezes. Dustin stares at it, mind racing through logic and terror. Robin whispers that she has seen this phrasing echoed in fragments of older occult-style transcripts. Never this direct, never this alive. Nancy looks at Will with a fear she tries to hide. Will feels the sentence land inside his bones. It doesn't read like prophecy. It reads like a verdict. He understands what the others are beginning to suspect. The hive has been shaping him as a final anchor, not because he is the strongest, but because he has always been the most connected. 11's distant presence flickers at the edge of Will's senses, an emotional echo that steadies him. He closes his eyes and reaches toward the lattice, not with power, but with resolve. If the enemy is built on stolen memory, then memory reclaimed can become a blade. For a brief, fragile window, the throne lattice quiets, like it is listening to him. Dustin whispers a plan that sounds more like a prayer. If Will can hold the connection stable, they might open a path to Max's glass prison without letting the hive seize control of the bridge. It's a narrow route, and the cost could be catastrophic. Will nods anyway. Above ground, the military strike timer hasn't stopped. It has only been delayed. The rogue faction will not tolerate public humiliation for long. The clock is still moving, just angrier now. Below, the hive pulses once, hard, deliberate, as if accepting Will's challenge. The corridor beyond the throne lattice opens like a throat. The group advances into a space that feels older than any human grief, a void shaped not by architecture but by appetite. The air is colder here, not in temperature, but in intention. This is the root chamber Dustin feared existed, a place where the hive's true feeding mechanism is no longer a theory. They find the structures embedded in the walls, vast bone-like growths that look fossilized, yet faintly alive. Robin runs her hands along the surface and feels an ancient pattern etched into the texture. It resembles ritual script, Latin-styled but distorted, as if language itself has been corrupted by something that learned humanity secondhand. She pulls her translated transcript from earlier research, comparing the symbols. Her voice catches as meaning clicks into place. The term is not poetic. It is literal. A memory eater. The hive doesn't just kill, it consumes identity. It turns trauma into infrastructure, using human pain as both fuel and mortar. Every disappearance, every hallucination, every time gap in Hawkins is not random violence, it is harvesting. Dustin's fear turns into furious clarity. He maps the pulse rhythm against Robin's translation notes and begins to see how the system stabilizes itself. The more a town is fractured emotionally, the easier it is for the boundary to thin. Fear is not a side effect. It is the mechanism. Steve absorbs the revelation with a grim, quiet rage. The protector in him knows what this means. Brute force won't be enough. You can't defeat a creature that feeds on fear by giving it more fear. Nancy steps forward, eyes locked on the chamber's central seam. She sees ghostly silhouettes suspended in faint light, victims reduced to flickers of story. She thinks of the missing names in her list, the people erased twice, once by the hive, once by the government's ink. Jonathan steadies her hand. The moment is brief, but it's enough to remind them that love is not sentimental here. It is tactical. Lucas hears a whisper in the static. Not clear words, but a rhythm that matches Max's spikes on the hospital chart. He understands now that her mind is caught somewhere within this feeding system. She is not simply asleep. She is imprisoned in a network designed to digest her identity slowly. Will stands at the edge of the chamber's pulse field and feels the enemy trying to read him like a book it intends to rewrite. His connection sharpens into painful clarity. He fights to hold the line, forcing himself to remember not the terror but the people, the bikes, the jokes, the music, the silly human details that monsters can't fully imitate. Robin finishes translating the final line of the transcript aloud, voice shaking. Healing collapses the gate. The sentence reframes everything. The war isn't only a battle of power, it's a battle of meaning. If the hive feeds on unresolved trauma, then unity and reclaimed identity may be the disruption mechanism they've been missing. As the chamber trembles, the group realizes they are not just fighting to destroy a structure, they are fighting to deny the enemy its food. Somewhere above, sirens rise again. The strike delay is ending. And below, the memory eater responds to their discovery with a pulse that feels like a warning. Understanding is now a threat it intends to silence. The pulse of the hive turns erratic, like a heart panicking against its own rhythm. Each vibration shivers through the ground, rattling bones and willpower alike. Dustin's voice cracks over the static. "She's in there. We're right on her signal." The group gathers around the lattice node that glows a shade of gold, different from the hive's usual cold light. It's warmer, human. Lucas recognizes it instantly. His breath catches, his hands shake. It's her, Max. 11's distant psychic echo threads faintly through the air, guiding them like a whisper from somewhere between worlds. "Follow the pattern," her voice says inside their heads, "but don't let the hive speak through you." Lucas starts the connection sequence Dustin built. A crude, jury-rigged system of overlapping frequencies synced to Max's hospital vitals. The devices hum like a choir of dying machines. Robin anchors the readings while Steve and Jonathan guard the perimeter. The Upside Down has gone silent, not in surrender, but in observation. Nancy helps Lucas calibrate the final pulse. "If this works," she mutters, "it'll either wake her or wake something else." They activate the link. The chamber collapses inward. The group is pulled into a shared psychic projection, a place shaped like Hawkins but drained of color, built from fog and broken memories. Max stands at the center of the ghost town street, barefoot, eyes wide with confusion. She looks older, thinner, more aware of the silence around her. Lucas calls her name. For a second, she doesn't react. Then her head turns, as if she's been hearing his voice for months, but only now believes it's real. "You're not supposed to be here," she says softly. "It doesn't like visitors." Dustin appears beside her image, scanning the spectral ground. The air hums with data he can't read. Robin records through her headset, whispering to the others. We're standing in her mind's translation of the hive. Every thought she's ever had is an echo here. Max looks down at her hands, translucent and flickering. "I tried to leave. Every time I do, it shows me other versions, the ones where I didn't fight back, where I stayed broken." Lucas steps closer. "Then let's remind it who you are." He reaches into his jacket and unfolds the letter. The words, though smeared, radiate something beyond ink, memory solid enough to fracture illusion. The fog ripples. The hive reacts violently, trying to drown the sound of his voice. "Remember the music," Lucas shouts over the roar. "Remember the song that pulled you back once." And somewhere in both realities, the hospital room and this psychic echo, Kate Bush begins to play through an ancient, distorted speaker. The melody threads through the hive like light through dirty glass. Max gasps, eyes snapping open within the psychic landscape. "I can see it," she whispers. "The way out." The sky above them shatters, revealing the heart breach pulsing far below. The hive howls, recognizing intrusion as rebellion. For the first time, its reaction isn't hunger, it's fear. The psychic projection collapses, hurling the group back into the physical chamber. Everyone lands hard, dirt, ash, echoes ringing in their heads. Max's name flashes across Dustin's monitor. In erratic bursts, her heartbeat is synchronizing again. She's alive, barely, but alive. The hive roars through the walls, a chorus of static and rage. It has learned emotion from its prey, and it hates it. Nancy steadies herself, blood dripping from her temple. "It's reacting to us emotionally," she says, voice trembling. "Every time we feel something human, it recoils." Robin wipes the dirt from her recorder, eyes wide with dawning comprehension. Then maybe that's the point. Maybe emotion isn't weakness. Maybe it's the firewall we needed all along. Dustin looks up from the readings. "If that's true," he says, "we can't just fight this thing. We have to remind it what it used to be." Will steps forward, breathing ragged. "It was never human, Dustin." His voice softens. "But it learned from us. It became what we feared most, because that's what we fed it." The chamber trembles again, stronger. Massive fissures crack through the floor, exposing streams of blue light, data veins that look disturbingly alive. Steve grabs Robin, pulling her away from a collapsing ledge. Lucas clings to the lattice core, still connected to Max, through the psychic link. Then, for a fleeting instant, the hive's rhythm changes. Its roar softens. The pulse steadies. Will looks up, confusion etched across his face. "It's listening." Eleven's voice filters through the static again, closer now, steadier. "It's learning your frequency. Stay with it." Nancy nods. "It feeds on pain, so show it something else." The group gathers around Will as he closes his eyes. Together they begin to speak, not in fear, not in defiance, but in memory. Robin recalls laughter in Scoops Ahoy. Dustin talks about the first D&D campaign that ever made them feel invincible. Lucas recounts the night they watched fireworks, the sound of Max's laughter mixing with the echo of freedom. Nancy whispers about friendship, forgiveness, and how truth doesn't always have to hurt. Each word pushes back against the hum of the hive. The sound warps into something unfamiliar, harmony. Then Will speaks last, his voice breaking. "We remember who we are." The hive convulses, the lights flicker, a ripple of warmth spreads through the lattice, melting the sharp, cold architecture into fluid light. And in that collapse, Dustin's monitor flares green. Max's vitals stabilize. Her eyes open miles away in the hospital bed, a single tear tracing down her cheek. But the cost arrives instantly. The hive redirects all energy to Will, its unwilling translator. His body arches, screaming as the ancient consciousness pours its full focus into him. The Upside Down has decided to negotiate in the only language it knows: takeover. Above ground, the strike sirens hit their final stage. Hopper's voice echoes through the comms. "Whatever you're doing down there, finish it. You've got 15 minutes before everything burns." And deep below, Will opens his eyes, no longer entirely himself. The hive has found its voice. The world above is preparing to burn. Below, in the gut of Hawkins, the group stares into the heart of something that shouldn't exist. A place where biology, memory, and nightmare have fused into one architecture. The throne lattice has dissolved into something worse, a sprawling network of glowing strands, stretching into a hollow the size of a cathedral. At its center, suspended in the blue-white radiance, is a mass of frozen echoes, human silhouettes trapped mid-motion, as though the Upside Down has been collecting moments instead of bodies. Will stands before them, trembling, his body half lit by the psychic glow. His breathing syncs with the pulses that run through the chamber. Dustin whispers, "It's talking through him." Will's voice follows, layered, his tone mixed with something deeper, resonant, ancient. The circle must close, the memory must feed itself. Mike steps forward despite every instinct screaming to stay back. "Will, you're stronger than it. You don't belong to this." For a heartbeat, Will's expression flickers, a human pain breaking through the alien calm. Nancy signals to Robin and Erica to set up the sonic disruptor prototype. Robin's hands move fast. Erica reads off frequency data through gritted teeth. The hive's rhythm has changed since it latched onto him. We can't use brute force. It'll kill him before it breaks. Lucas looks at the figures inside the lattice and suddenly recognizes one shape among them, a child holding a bike helmet. He swallows hard. "It's us," he murmurs. "It's been watching us this whole time, copying us." Jonathan steadies Nancy's shaking hands as she levels her flashlight toward the chamber floor. There, etched in the bioluminescent filaments, is a pattern that mirrors the town's map, Hawkins redrawn in veins of living light. The hive hasn't just lived beneath the town, it is the town. Will begins to convulse. Dustin yells, "He's the anchor. If we don't pull him back, it rewrites the whole system around him." Lucas rips open his pack and finds the cassette labeled Max. "Music brought her back," he says, voice breaking. "Maybe it can pull him too." He presses play. The old song hums through the chamber, faint but defiant. The hive's rhythm stutters, disoriented. Will gasps, his voice returning, fractured. It remembers. The sound. The energy in the room spikes. Robin screams, "Everyone down!" As a shockwave bursts outward, the lattice splits in half, revealing a narrow passage spiraling deeper into darkness. On the far side, a whisper echoes. "The heart must eat itself to end." Dustin looks at the glowing map, then at the widening crack beneath their feet. "That's the root chamber," he says, eyes wild, "and it's waiting for him." The ground shudders, the ceiling rains dust. Above, muffled thunder signals engines arming for the strike. They have minutes, one last descent, and Will Byers has to decide if saving Hawkins means ending himself. Heat radiates from above as the countdown begins. The Army's strike planes circle the dark horizon. Their engines are the sound of inevitability. Underground, that same heat manifests as trembling air. The worlds are bleeding into each other, time and gravity losing shape. Will stands at the mouth of the root chamber. The others surround him, every face lit by the trembling light below. The path spirals downward into a void pulsing with gold and blue veins. The heart breach, the oldest wound of all. "Whatever happens," Dustin says quietly, "we can't let it end without meaning." The chamber hums like a choir of ghosts. From its center rises the shape of the consciousness, not a monster, but a vast network of eyes, voices, and silhouettes folding in on each other, a living archive of everything the Upside Down ever consumed. 11's presence suddenly floods the space, a psychic projection bleeding through the connection. Her image flickers beside Will, shimmering like static light. "You're not alone," she tells him, voice fierce and steady. "Not this time." Will turns to her, tears streaming freely. "If I let it collapse, it takes me with it." 11 nods. "Then I go with you." Mike steps forward, voice breaking. "No, no one dies alone again. Not here." The hive reacts violently to their unity. The air convulses, the light shifts from blue to red. Lucas grips the ground as tremors tear through the floor. Max's heart monitor, miles away, begins to spike again. Her voice echoes faintly through the static. "Don't let go." Robin screams over the roar. Hopper says 2 minutes. Nancy and Jonathan rig the last disruptor into the cavern floor. "We give them an ending," she says, pressing the activation button. "One they can't erase." The chamber floods with harmonic light. The disruptor amplifies their collective memory. Every moment of friendship, pain, love, laughter, broadcast through the same frequency the hive uses to feed. For the first time, the enemy chokes on what it tried to consume. Will steps into the core, his body glowing from within. The psychic storm twists around him, a hurricane made of stolen identities, screaming for release. 11 raises her hand beside him, adding her power to his heartbeat. "You took everything," Will says, voice steady. Now we give it back. They unleash it, all at once. The explosion isn't fire, it's memory detonating. Every image, every scream, every life the hive devoured bursts outward like 1,000 suns returning home. The lattice disintegrates into light. Hawkins trembles. Above ground, Hopper's planes abort mid-strike as seismic readings spike off the charts. The fissures collapse inward, vanishing into stillness. The sky clears for the first time in weeks. Below, the dust settles. The chamber is gone, the root, the hive, the noise, all gone. Only silence remains. Dustin calls for Will, no answer, then a faint voice, exhausted but alive. Still here. 11 collapses beside him, breathing hard but smiling through tears. The others rush forward, pulling them into trembling embraces. The ground around them cools. For the first time since the beginning, Hawkins is quiet. But as they climb back toward the surface, Dustin looks down one last time at the place where the heart breach once pulsed. The ground glows faintly, now red, not blue, but gold, alive, waiting. For the first time in weeks, the air above Hawkins tastes clean. The dust has settled into a strange stillness, and the sky, once a bruised, swirling storm, now lies pale and fragile, like the world is holding its breath. But peace here never feels honest. It feels like the pause between heartbeats, before the next one decides whether to continue or stop. The group emerges from the collapsed corridor in silence. Their faces are gray with soot and exhaustion, their bodies shaking from adrenaline that has nowhere left to go. Steve pulls 11 out first, her arm limp over his shoulder, but her eyes alive. Joyce and Hopper are waiting near the containment perimeter. When they see the kids, the impossible mixture of grief and relief crosses their faces, the expression of people who've stopped daring to believe in miracles, but got one anyway. "Where's Will?" Joyce's voice cracks. He appears last, walking slowly out of the fissure's mouth, light still fading from the veins on his arms. His skin glows faintly, residual energy crackling like static in a storm. He looks older, aged by seconds that felt like lifetimes. When Joyce rushes to him, he stumbles into her arms. "It's over," he whispers. "At least, I think it is." But Dustin, standing a few steps behind, isn't so sure. He looks at the ground where the fissure used to be, smooth now, sealed, but faintly glowing gold. "That's not gone," he murmurs. "That's dormant." The military retreats under orders they don't understand. The general who authorized the strike has disappeared from the chain of command, silenced by leaks, reports, and Hopper's unrelenting defiance. For once, the truth outran the lie. Night moves again. Hawkins is dark, not because of power outages, but because the town is finally still enough to sleep. Streetlights flicker like they're remembering how to exist without screaming. At the hospital, Max wakes for real this time. Her eyes flutter open, glassy, confused, alive. Lucas is asleep in a chair beside her bed, her letter still in his hand. When she whispers his name, he doesn't respond immediately. He thinks he's dreaming, but when he looks up and sees her awake, he breaks. No heroic composure, just tears. Across town, Nancy finishes typing her final report, an honest one. Names, dates, experiments, victims. She doesn't know if anyone will publish it, but that's not the point. The point is that it exists. Truth no longer belongs to classified files. Robin helps clean up the safe house, her humor quieter now, more deliberate. Steve stays late, sitting on the porch, watching the empty streets. "Feels weird," he says softly. "Winning." Robin replies, "We didn't win, we survived. That's different." Will stands alone near the sealed ground. He can still feel it breathing beneath his feet, a faint, rhythmic vibration in sync with his pulse. He touches his neck. The scar where the darkness once gripped him is quiet, not gone, just sleeping. He glances toward the horizon where dawn is breaking. "You can rest now," 11 says quietly behind him. He nods but doesn't move. "Yeah," he says, voice thin. "But what if it wakes up before we do?" Neither of them has an answer. The wind carries the faint hum of life underground, a reminder, a warning. For now, Hawkins is whole again, but the heart of the world still beats beneath it. Morning rises over Hawkins with a golden stillness that feels almost unreal. The town looks peaceful, but there's a quiet undercurrent running through the air, a hum that isn't mechanical or natural. It's something else, something alive, faint, patient. The group meets one last time at the buyer's house, now standing half in shadow, half in light. The dining table is cluttered with maps, broken devices, and cups of untouched coffee. Everyone is there: Hopper, Joyce, Nancy, Jonathan, Robin, Steve, Lucas, Max, Dustin, 11, and Will. It feels like the end of a war council, or maybe the beginning of something worse. Joyce starts first. "No more secrets," she says. "If this thing ever comes back, we face it together. No labs, no governments, no lies." Hopper grunts in agreement, though his eyes drift toward the window, toward the rebuilt skyline. "It won't be the same, Hawkins," he says, "but maybe that's good. Maybe we stop pretending this place was ever normal." Dustin finishes running diagnostics on what remains of the disruptor device. "The readings are low," he mutters, like the upside-down's heartbeat has faded into the background noise, but it's still there under everything, like static waiting for a signal. Robin crosses her arms. "So, we didn't kill it. We just taught it how to sleep?" Will, sitting near the corner, looks up. "Or maybe we taught it to remember." The room falls silent. "It wasn't always trying to destroy us," he says carefully. "It was trying to understand us. It just didn't know how to be alive without pain." 11 nods. "That's what makes it dangerous. It learns." The silence that follows is heavy but not hopeless. These aren't kids anymore. They're survivors who've learned that victory doesn't mean peace. Lucas and Max sit close, hands touching lightly. She's still fragile, still piecing memories together, but every moment she remembers is a victory. Nancy closes her notebook for the last time, choosing life over documentation. Steve laughs quietly at something Robin says, the sound almost normal. Almost. Outside, the air carries a faint shimmer as sunlight passes through the thin mist over the forest line. Hawkins looks new, but the ground remembers. Later that evening, Will walks alone to the edge of town. The wind hums faintly, that same golden resonance from the heart breach, now pulsing beneath the soil. He kneels, placing his hand on the ground. For a long time, nothing happens. Then a gentle pulse answers back, not cold, not cruel, just aware. Will exhales. "I know," he whispers. "I remember too." He turns toward the horizon where the sun dips behind the trees, bathing Hawkins in twilight gold. For now, the silence holds. But deep underground, something hums again, slow, curious, alive, not a threat, not yet, just memory, waiting for a reason to wake. Hawkins doesn't celebrate victory the way other towns might. It absorbs it cautiously, like a patient testing a limb after a long coma. The streets are quieter, the air less hostile, but the calm still feels borrowed, like the kind of peace that can be revoked if someone in a uniform decides the story is too dangerous to leave behind. The military remains on the edges of town, but their posture has changed. The leaked documents, Nancy's broadcasts, and the flood of public witnesses have forced a shift that even the most stubborn commanders can't ignore. Cameras are everywhere now. So are reporters. The government's greatest enemy has become visibility. Hopper understands this better than anyone. He moves through the command architecture with a bruised calm, the kind that comes from surviving too much to be impressed by rank anymore. He doesn't trust the delay the kids bought underground. He knows delays are temporary, and the rogue faction that authorized the strike won't simply let history rewrite them as villains. He finds the last link in the chain of escalation, a deputy commander whose conscience is wobbling under the weight of public exposure. Hopper doesn't threaten him, he gives him the truth. There's no victory in detonating a town that has already paid the price for the government's decades of arrogance. There's only the kind of guilt that never fades, even after promotions. Joyce stands beside him, not as support, but as pressure, a reminder that this isn't a strategic negotiation. It's a human one. The stand-down order is drafted in a sterile office that smells like old coffee and fear. It's typed, signed, and stamped with enough authority to break the momentum of the strike machine. When Hopper takes the paper into his hands, it feels absurdly fragile for something that can save thousands of lives. But paper is what saved them before. Paper is what exposed the lies. Paper is what turned the tide. Outside, civilians gather near perimeter lines, no longer begging for safety but demanding accountability. Some hold printed pages of the leaked memos like badges of reclaimed agency. Others hold handwritten lists of missing names, refusing to let the town be cleaned up into a simplified victory narrative. Down the hospital corridor, Max's recovery inches forward like sunrise in slow motion. She's awake now, fragile but present, and every time she squeezes Lucas's hand, it feels like a promise that trauma doesn't get to write the final chapter alone. Dustin and Robin monitor the residual readings across town. The fissures are sealed, but the instruments still record faint background anomalies, low enough to dismiss, too consistent to ignore. The gold-toned resonance beneath the soil remains quiet, like a sleeping animal that has learned what traps feel like. Will feels it most sharply. He tries to pretend he doesn't, tries to sit inside normal conversation with the others, but his senses keep drifting toward the ground like a needle pulled by unseen magnetism. The scar at his neck is calm, but calm doesn't mean empty. It means contained. As the stand-down order is broadcast across military channels, engines that were warming for catastrophe begin to power down. The strike planes reroute. The emergency demolition teams are recalled. A collective exhale moves through Hawkins, not as relief alone, but as disbelief that the world might finally have chosen them over the convenience of erasure. That night, the fissure sites remain silent. But near the old heart breach location, Will pauses as a faint pulse flickers. Not red, not blue, gold. A quiet reminder that the end of violence is not always the end of influence. The next morning arrives with a thin, winter-like clarity. The sky is clean enough to make the last few weeks feel unreal, as if Hawkins briefly slipped into someone else's nightmare and returned with ash still clinging to its clothes. But the group knows better than to mistake blue skies for closure. Dustin's latest readings confirm what his instincts have been shouting since the root chamber collapse. The hive structure is fractured, but not erased. The system has lost its spine, its command lattice, its ability to synchronize terror into control. Yet the underlying phenomenon, the thinness, the receptive geology, the ancient listening under Hawkins, still exists in faint traces. Robin brings a translated excerpt from her older transcripts and new notes from the pirate archive. She believes the enemy was weakened not only by power, but by exposure, by collective memory turned into resistance. When people refused to be erased or ashamed, the hive lost its easiest fuel. Nancy doesn't frame that as hope. She frames it as responsibility. She compiles a final public dossier with a level of detail that makes her hands shake. She names programs, lists dates, records missing civilians, and includes the stand-down proof as the turning point that prevented a government-made massacre. She isn't just telling a story, she's building a barrier against the next cover-up. Steve and Jonathan help distribute copies through local networks. They don't trust digital systems alone. Paper is harder to quietly delete. In the evening, the group gathers near the sealed ground. No grand ceremony, no declared victory. Just a circle of survivors testing the silence together. Will is the last to step forward. He kneels slowly, pressing his palm to the soil, like a person listening for a heartbeat beneath a locked door. He doesn't feel cold this time. He feels awareness. The gold pulse returns, faint and hesitant, almost cautious. It is not the rage of Vecna's reign. It is not the hunger of the memory eater in full bloom. It feels like something injured and learning. The idea unsettles Eleven more than open violence ever did, because a learning enemy is harder to predict than a furious one. Will closes his eyes and speaks quietly, not to summon, but to define terms. His words are simple, original, and resolute. He refuses the role of anchor, refuses the identity of gateway. He names himself out loud as a human being first. 11 places her hand over his, grounding the moment with quiet solidarity. Mike stands behind them, tense but unflinching. Lucas and Max, still fragile, still stitching themselves back together, watch with the understanding that survival now requires vigilance that looks like love. The pulse fades, not defeated, not victorious, contained by choice. Dustin exhales slowly. Robin lowers her recorder. Nancy holds the final dossier like a sealed oath. And for the first time, the group understands that the endgame wasn't just about closing a door. It was about changing the rules of who gets to own the truth after the door disappears. As night falls, Hawkins lights up in small human ways. Porch lamps, diner signs, the muted laughter of people trying to remember how to live without an apocalypse scheduled for dawn. But in the last seconds before the screen would cut to black, a single radio report from a distant county crackles overheard in a newsroom. A strange cold bloom has been reported far from Indiana. No confirmed cause, no official explanation. The silence in Hawkins holds. Yet the world beyond it feels a little thinner than yesterday. Hawkins wakes into a kind of stillness that feels alien. The fissures are gone, the air is clearer, and the horizon no longer glows like a wound refusing to close. But the town looks like a place that has survived a disaster and is unsure whether it's allowed to exhale. Streets are patched, windows boarded, people moving slowly as if the ground might change its mind. In the days that follow, the military presence thins, not out of mercy, but out of necessity. The stand-down order has done more than delay violence. It has reshaped consequence. Cameras, witnesses, and leaked documents have turned secrecy into a liability. Commanders who once spoke in absolutes now speak in careful phrases, their authority eroding under the weight of public memory. Hopper walks through the perimeter like a man dismantling a trap he's watched spring too many times. Joyce stays close to the kids, refusing to let them become separate casualties of two different wars. When the last convoy rolls out, it doesn't feel like a triumph. It feels like the town reclaiming its own breath. At the hospital, Max's recovery becomes the most fragile proof that the world has tilted back toward life. She is awake, exhausted, disoriented, and stubbornly real. Lucas sits beside her with the quiet devotion of someone who has already lost her 100 times in his head. She cannot remember everything yet, but she remembers enough to anchor herself. His voice, the music, the feeling that she was not abandoned. Dustin watches this with a scientist's awe and a friend's relief. He's already running new readings, charting the residual anomalies that still flicker faintly beneath Hawkins. The numbers are low, almost dismissible, but the pattern is consistent, like a heartbeat at rest. Robin notes every detail, her recorder now as essential as any weapon they carried below ground. History is still a battlefield, and she refuses to let anyone claim ignorance again. Nancy sits in a makeshift newsroom, typing what might be the most dangerous document she will ever create. It isn't a dramatic manifesto. It's worse for the people who want the past buried. It's a restoration record. Names of the missing, dates of suppressed operations, proof of the asset language, and the final stand-down that saved the town from being erased for convenience. Jonathan helps her verify each entry. Steve quietly arranges community distribution routes, ensuring the truth travels in both digital form and physical copies that can't be deleted with a keystroke. Will stays quieter than the rest, not because he's broken, because he's listening. The cold is gone, but the awareness remains like faint static at the edges of his senses. The gold-toned resonance beneath the soil has dimmed into background silence. It isn't gone. It feels contained. One evening, the group gathers at the edge of the sealed heart site without ceremony. No speeches, no grand declarations, just the human ritual of showing up for one another. 11 rests close to Will, her presence steadying in a way power never could. Mike watches them both like someone who has finally learned that love is vigilance, not panic. The night ends softly. The town still stands. The kids still stand. The world has not collapsed into the abyss it flirted with for weeks. But as everyone begins to drift home, Dustin pauses, glancing down at his latest readings. The signal is quieter, not dead, just sleeping. The memorial is held beneath a winter-white sky that feels too clean for the grief it witnesses. Hawkins gathers in a public square that once hosted parades and now hosts truth. Flowers line the steps of a temporary stage. Names are read aloud, not just of the dead, but of the missing whose stories deserve to be acknowledged. The act is simple and radical. The town refuses secrecy as a coping mechanism. Hopper stands near Joyce with a grief that has learned discipline. He doesn't pretend strength is effortless. Joyce looks around at the community she fought to protect and realizes that survival has become a shared identity. They don't speak much during the ceremony. Their presence says enough. Max attends in a wheelchair, wrapped in blankets, alive in a way that still feels miraculous. Lucas never lets go of her hand. Dustin sits nearby, exhausted and breathing through the strange guilt of being right about the convergence date, and grateful he was also right about the possibility of stopping it. Robin and Steve stand together with the quiet ease of people who have rebuilt trust through fire. Nancy and Jonathan remain watchful, even in peace, because they understand what power does when it is embarrassed. After the memorial, life begins its slow, stubborn return. Stores reopen, schools attempt schedules again, streets are repaired with the kind of practical hope that doesn't need a speech. The town restoration record Nancy compiled is distributed in libraries, community centers, and local offices. Paper copies filed in public view. The truth is no longer locked in a cabinet. It has a home in daylight. That evening, Will returns to the buyer's house alone. He finds the sealed letter he left before the descent, addressed to Joyce, meant for the worst outcome. He holds it for a long moment, feeling the weight of the version of himself who wrote it. Terrified, brave, trying to protect his mother from another impossible loss. He opens it. The words inside aren't dramatic. They are human. A son's quiet love, a promise that he tried to be more than his fear, and a confession that he didn't want to be a symbol anymore. He wanted to be a person. Joyce reads it with trembling hands later, then pulls him into a fierce embrace that feels like a second rescue. Across town, 11 sits with Mike and the others, not as a weapon, not as an asset, but as family chosen in the crucible of impossible survival. Her powers feel steadier now, not stronger in raw force, but calmer in intention. The difference is subtle and profound. She is not pushing against herself anymore. She is living inside her own name. Near midnight, Will walks to the sealed heart site one last time. He kneels, places his hand on the ground, and listens. The gold pulse does not answer loudly. It responds like a distant echo, acknowledging a boundary. He doesn't threaten it. He doesn't invite it. He simply exists without permission. And that somehow feels like the final victory. Far away in another town that hasn't learned the word fissure yet, a radio station reports a strange meteorological event. An inexplicable cold bloom brief and localized, dismissed by officials as an anomaly. But the tone of the report carries unease. Back in Hawkins, the camera of the story would linger on the quiet streetlights, the repaired houses, the kids who are no longer kids. The night holds, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the world remains thin enough to remind us that endings are sometimes just doors closed softly, not locked forever.